Chapter 6, Coues Deer, Hunting Jack O'Connor's Deer. Known for his sheep hunting, O'Connor put the Coues deer on the map, and hunting this desert whitetail remains one of North America's most enchanting hunts. Nearly 3/4 of a century have passed since a bespectacled English professor from Arizona emerged as the greatest American hunting writer of all time. There were hunting writers before Jack O'Connor, and there'll be hunting writers as long as there are hunters. But few could dispute the title O'Connor wore as Dean of us all. He made his bones in a pre-television era, when the big outdoor magazines were on top of the heap, and he lived in a time and place when he could gather field experience that simply cannot be matched today. He was also, in the technical and literary sense, a damn good writer. Remember, he was an English professor first. My longtime boss at Peterson's Hunting, Ken Elliott, had the privilege to edit dozens of O'Connor manuscripts. He tells me the raw copy was perfect, except that O'Connor, always the perfectionist, would call him and ask him to exchange words here and there to make it more perfect. This was in the sunset of a long career. By the 1970s, O'Connor had hunted the world and undoubtedly had become best known as Mr. Sheep Hunter. He loved to hunt mountain sheep, and he did it more than any writer before or since, mostly in a time when America's big game was at its nadir and all big game hunting was armchair adventure for most of his readers. O'Connor only saw the beginning of, and probably never envisioned, the explosion of the whitetail opportunity we have today. However, his reputation as a sheep hunter and his international hunting came later, many years after he was already the premier American hunting writer. Like most of us in the business, he started out writing about things close to home that he knew about. Prominent in his early writings, and always one of his favorites, was the Coues Whitetail. In fact, he hunted and sold stories about Coues whitetails long before he hunted desert sheep. Most of us non-Arizonans who've hunted the Coues whitetail have done so because of Jack O'Connor. And most of us who've hunted this pretty little desert deer have become enchanted by them. When O'Connor was a boy, the Coues deer was still considered a different species of deer from the Virginia deer. This mistake dates back to the 1880s, when this desert adaptation of Odocoilus virginianus was identified as a separate species. This tiny deer was studied and named after U.S. Army Quartermaster Elliott Coues. Yes, it's properly pronounced Coues, as Lieutenant Coues pronounced his name, although Coues has become the most common pronunciation. Later biologists would downgrade Coues species to a subspecies, but the founders of the Boone and Crockett record system separated it into its own category, and so it remains. With fully 38 subspecies of whitetail deer ranging from the Amazon basin in South America to Canada's treeline, it seems a gross oversimplification for Elliott Coues deer to have its own category and all other North American subspecies to be lumped together. Simple tradition aside, however, there's good reason to continue this practice. First, the Coues whitetail is geographically isolated from larger whitetail subspecies, whereas broad intergrade areas exist between most other U.S. and Canadian races. The Coues deer has no whitetail at all to its west and north. To its east, in western Coahuila and Texas Big Bend region, lies the Carmen Mountain subspecies, which may be slightly smaller than even the Coues deer. They may well be one and the same. To the south, Coues deer eventually intergrade with still smaller tropical subspecies. Unlike the differences between, say, the northern Ovi borealis and the Kansas Ovi macroris subspecies, the differences between the Coues whitetail and the other U.S. and Canadian subspecies are dramatic. Smaller body size, iron gray color, muted throat patch, enlarged ears and tail, distinctive and diminutive antlers. The differences are striking enough that early biologists can be forgiven for jumping to conclusions about finding a new species of deer. The small size of the Coues whitetail is not a valid reason to perpetuate the mistake. After all, the Florida whitetails, also a bona fide subspecies, can't compete with Alberta whitetails any more than Coues whitetails can, but they don't have their own category. The fact that Coues deer hunting is strikingly different from hunting the other North American whitetails is another compelling reason for continuing the tradition, especially for those of us who love to hunt them. My uncle, longtime Boone and Crockett Club member Art Popham, had a mounted Coues deer head in a corner of his den in Kansas City. He attended the University of Arizona in the 1930s, and that whitetail head, 2 decades old when I first noticed it, was a memento of whitetail hunts with his English instructor, Jack O'Connor, and a border patrolman named George Parker. I don't know if it was that pretty petite mount, my uncle's stories of hunting with O'Connor and Parker, or O'Connor's wonderful writing about his favorite little deer, but I always wanted to hunt the Coues deer. Oddly, it was the year after O'Connor's death before I finally did. And like everyone who has hunted them, I became enthralled by these pretty little deer in the desert mountains they call home. And after nearly 40 years, I still am. The arid mountains the Coues Whitetails call home are always beautiful, but in the summer heat they're hardly inviting. The opposite is true in the winter, when cold mornings and evenings and sunny cloudless days are the norm. December and January, the prime time for Coues deer, is a glorious time to be in the southwest mountains, and not a bad time to be far away from much of the Virginia whitetail's territory. The deer, too, are strikingly beautiful. If you need sheer antler mass to be impressed, the Coues whitetail probably isn't for you. However, the charm of the Coues whitetail is its very petiteness, its attractive color, and the wonderful way it fits into those desert mountains. It's also tremendously challenging and interesting to hunt. Coues deer, like all whitetails, are somewhat habitual, but they're thinly distributed over vast country, so habitual is a relative term. You can't exactly sit in a tree stand on an established trail and expect to see the same buck again and again, but you could expect to see the same buck in the same canyon or on the same mountain. Over the years, I've had the good fortune to know some of the truly great Coues deer hunters. I wish I'd had the chance to talk to O'Connor about them, but I didn't. I did, however, spend a good deal of time with the late George Parker, one of America's greatest hunters, a guy who should be better known than he is. Parker was the real McCoy, a decorated hero of World War II, rancher, border patrolman, prolific hunter. He put more Coues deer in all the record books than any other hunter, but he also hunted the world. He was one of very few to take a giant sable in Angola. He collected the Big Five in East Africa, and he hunted extensively in Southeast Asia. His lifelong friend, Colonel Charles Askins, referred to him as the tough one. Tough, yes, but always the perfect gentleman, and always on the lookout for big Coues deer bucks. In Jack O'Connor and George Parker's era, Coues deer hunting was pretty simple. Parker told me they didn't even use binoculars much until well after World War II. Mostly they'd just ride saddle horses through good country, and when they jumped a buck that looked good, they'd bail and blaze. There wasn't much hunting pressure then, and there were lots of deer, especially on the Mexican side of the border where most of O'Connor's hunting was done and where most of Parker's big bucks came from. Those were different times, too. O'Connor himself wrote that they interpreted Sonora's game laws as allowing 2 or 3 per trip. O'Connor eventually moved up to Idaho, and as far as I know, that ended his Coues deer hunting. Parker continued to hunt them until he died. Bill Quimby, longtime editor of Safari magazine, hunted with him several times down in Arizona's Canelo Hills. In later years, Parker traded his horse for an open Jeep, but the methodology remained much the same. Cruise the open grassy hills characteristic of that area until deer were spotted or jumped. It doesn't sound real serious compared to the way dedicated trophy hunters pursue them today, but Parker knew where to look for the good ones and also knew what a big Coues deer looked like. His record in Records of North American Big Game speaks for itself. O'Connor-Parker style Coues deer hunting can still be done. These little desert deer are thinly distributed over vast country. As O'Connor said, even where there are lots of them, there aren't very many of them. However, hunting pressure is also well distributed and quite light, especially compared to most eastern whitetail range. Buck-doe ratios are fairly high, and although Coues deer are never easy to find, once located, they're actually fairly unsophisticated, again, compared to other hunter-educated whitetails. If you cover enough ground, chances are you'll see some bucks. In January of 2002, I took a very nice Coues whitetail the old-fashioned way. I was technically on a desert mule deer hunt with Ernesto Zaragoza, but I got my mule deer early in the hunt, so my Mexican guide and I headed up into the Rocky Hills, the same hills O'Connor, Parker, and my uncle hunted for Coues deer and desert sheep. We were looking for whitetails. We didn't have the big binoculars or spotting scope that have been part and parcel to most of my Coues deer hunting for many years, but we found deer. A doe started up out of a canyon, and what looked like a very good buck followed her. We were about 400 yards away, and they were moving. I didn't get a very good look, let alone a shot. They topped out and dropped into a little saddle, and we were pretty sure they stayed there. So we climbed the next ridge and approached that saddle carefully. Maybe not carefully enough. We were about 150 yards away and could see most, but not all, of the dead ground in the saddle when the doe scampered up the far slope, tail held high. I was certain the buck would follow, so I looked around for something to rest on. There was nothing but waist-high grass and tall ocotillo cactus, so I did the only thing I could do. I wrapped into a hasty sling, got as steady as I could, and waited. In seconds, the buck followed, trotting up after the doe. The view I got was exactly the same, from the rear. The buck was wide, heavy, had good eye guards, and the back points were good as well. I took the rest on faith. As he topped out, he turned to the right, giving me a broadside shot just as he was going into a thick cholla patch. The rifle went off and the deer went down. He was a very nice old buck, heavy-horned and downhill, but his front points didn't match the rear. So, in terms of score, he wasn't the buck I'd thought he might be. He wasn't a mistake. Any old buck like this is a fine trophy. However, this illustrates two problems with the old-fashioned style of Coues deer hunting. First, the shooting is generally real difficult. It's difficult enough with Coues deer. The country's huge and the deer is small. But a bobbing, weaving Coues buck is a tough target. Add in my offhand shooting position, and it was a hell of a shot, one I certainly couldn't do all the time. More importantly, however, is that I hadn't properly judged the quality of the deer, so I shot out of a general impression of size rather than actual knowledge. I might have been pleasantly surprised, but I wasn't, and you usually aren't. Over the years, I've come to believe that careful glassing with good optics is far and away the best way to hunt these little deer. My own introduction to Coues deer hunting was with Warner Glenn and his dad, the late Marvin Glenn of Douglas, Arizona. Warner hunts pretty much the same way he did back then with riding mules. It isn't pure O'Connor-style jump shooting, but a mixture of glassing, covering country, and even some mounted drives. To this day, the Glenn's guided hunts are pretty much 100% successful, so I don't conclude that Coues deer have gotten more difficult over the past 20 years. Possibly they've gotten more plentiful now that we're several deer generations into a 100% limited draw situation in Arizona. The first time I saw postgraduate glassing was with Dwayne Adams, a highly successful Coues deer outfitter out of San Manuel, Arizona. This was a long time ago. Dwayne wasn't an outfitter back then, just a Coues deer nut who knew how to find them. He had 15 by 60 Zeiss binoculars, an almost unknown product that long ago, and he set them up on a sturdy camera tripod and dismantled the hillsides piece by piece. Using this technique, Dwayne glassed up one of the biggest Coues deer bucks I've ever taken, but he made me a believer long before we ever found that deer. Regardless of where you hunt them, Arizona, Old Mexico, southwestern New Mexico, I'm convinced that pure, serious, concentrated glassing is the best way to get a big Coues deer today. O'Connor and Parker never hunted this way, but this is the method used by the modern-day Coues deer gurus. I always thought I knew how to glass, but not like that. I don't know who came up with the idea of putting ultra-powerful binoculars on a tripod, but Dwayne Adams should get a lot of the credit for popularizing the technique. It's ideal for Coues whitetails, where you're looking for small deer in big country, but it works equally well for virtually any game in big country. Jay Gates of Kingman, Arizona, probably America's top all-around deer hunter, uses this technique exclusively today, and he's taken several real bomber Coues deer. This is the same hunting technique used by outfitter Kirk Kelso and his guides. Kelso was hunting mostly in Sonora, where there are lots of Coues deer. On average, hunting down there is more successful than north of the border. I believe this is because on well-managed private lands, the deer are more concentrated, more accessible, and are subjected to less hunting pressure. A number of outfitters, both Mexicans and Americans operating with Mexican partners, are wonderfully successful at hunting Coues whitetails, but uniquely, Kelso really did an incredible job of producing big Coues bucks for his clients. Regrettably, he's out of Mexico now. In Mexico, Coues deer are plentiful enough that you can hike or ride through the hills, or even cruise ranch roads and find deer. Kelso, however, hunted them Arizona style. He used powerful tripod-mounted binoculars, and he glassed endlessly from vantage points until a suitable buck was located. Then he planned to stalk. Although I knew Kirk for years, the first time I hunted in his Sonora camp was 1999. Coues deer movement's funny. The weather's generally cool or cold in the morning with sunny middays, and usually one day doesn't seem much different from another to we humans, but there must be differences to the deer. One day you'll see bucks all over the place, and On another day that seems exactly the same, you'll see very few deer. My first hunting day in '99 was one of those days when very few deer were seen. With this in mind, I guess I messed up on the second day. We glassed several bucks right away, and I probably should have understood that this was a different day, but it didn't click. There was a very nice buck way up on a ridge, and I didn't hesitate. We made a stalk, got in a good position at about 300 yards, and I shot him. He was a nice clean 8-pointer, green scoring right at 100 inches, a very nice Coues buck, except as the week went on, he eventually became the second smallest buck in camp. The next year, the winter of 2000-2001, was an exceptionally good year for antler growth. I went back and took the best typical Coues buck I've ever taken, a beautiful heavy antlered 5x5, typical 10-pointer by Eastern count. In that particular year, this was not only not the largest buck taken by Kelso's clients, but just one of fully 14 bucks that topped Boone and Crockett's minimum score of 110 points for inclusion in the all-time records. It takes a good year for antler growth to produce that kind of success, but it also takes optics and technique. Kelso used big 15x and 20x binoculars from Zeiss and Swarovski, tripod mounted, and backed up with a big spotting scope. And he tried not to move on a deer until he was absolutely certain what he was looking at. There are just 4 places, at least in terms of political boundaries, to hunt Coues whitetails: southern Arizona, southwestern New Mexico, Sonora, and Chihuahua. Coues deer are discontinuous within this vast area, but they're found in most mountain ranges and hills, generally between about 4,000 and 8,000 feet in elevation. Far and away the least hunted and least known of these areas is the Mexican state of Chihuahua. I've been down there twice and have taken 2 nice bucks, neither monsters, but Chihuahua has yielded some dandies. After several years of studying it, my overall impression is that Sonora has more deer, so overall success is higher. However, in Chihuahua there are few outfitters, and thus there's been very little trophy hunting, so there are some great bucks. Wherever you hunt them, one of the things you can generally expect is beautiful weather and absolutely gorgeous country. The desert mountains are spectacular, so long as you don't get too close. The dozens of variety of cacti are dramatically beautiful. But don't bet the farm on good weather. The first time I hunted with Dwayne Adams in Arizona's Catalina Mountains north of Tucson, we ended the hunt huddled under an oak tree in cold rain and fog. The first time I hunted in Chihuahua, we were in high country west of the rugged El Nido Range, still locally believed to be the last stronghold of the Mexican grizzly. We had several days of high winds with little deer movement, and then it snowed like crazy. On the last day, we woke up to nearly a foot of the soft white stuff. This is always rare, but it can happen almost anywhere in Coues deer country. Our outfitter, Ernesto Beal, took us into some new country a bit farther south, and when we separated and headed up ridges in the dark, the stars were out, but not for long. Shortly after dawn, a fresh system came in, and visibility was obscured by thick, wet flakes. My guide, Anselmo, and I worked along the edge of a rimrock butte, glassing down into timbered pockets far below. That's where the deer were, and with the weather getting worse all the time, I shot a very nice 8-pointer, and I was glad to have him. There was a time when I hunted Jack O'Connor's deer almost every year, and I still would if I could. These days, quite honestly, Coues deer have gotten so popular, and there are so many doggone writers hunting them and writing about them, that I can no longer place stories about them as easily as I once could. So these days I lay off for a couple of years now and again, and when I do, I always miss the desert mountains. Sonora is definitely my favorite place, but I'd like to hunt Chihuahua again, and it's been too long since I've hunted them in Arizona. The wonderful thing about Coues deer is there really aren't any bad places to hunt them. The traditional ranges in Arizona produce well, as does Sonora. Chihuahua is very good, and New Mexico's herd seems to be growing and expanding. I haven't hunted them there yet, so I'll have to do that one of these days. I can't say that Coues deer hunting is my absolute favorite. I'm very much a generalist, and I enjoy almost equally a wide variety of hunting. But I can certainly understand why folks get so hooked on Coues whitetails. They're a uniquely beautiful little deer, and their desert mountains are usually a wonderful place to be in the fall and winter. It might have been a mistake to classify Coues whitetails separately from all the other Virginia deer, but I hope it's a mistake we never correct. When you go on an outfitted hunt, you're betting more than just your hard-earned cash. You're betting your vacation time, your safety, and your hunting dreams. You've got to get it right. There's a lot of ways to find a good outfitter, but a simple way is to go on my website, craigboddington.com, and take a look at our Craig Boddington Endorsed Outfitter program. Go on the website and you hook up directly with the outfitter. It's based on 40 years of hunting experience worldwide. My program's a group of outfitters that I believe in, and they believe in me. Hey, I know a good outfitter.